I never thought I'd see a land in my backyard, let alone own one. But life has a funny way of proving people wrong. For the past 5 years, I've lived in a quiet, upscale neighborhood just outside of the city. Wide streets lined with oak trees, manicured lawns, and houses that all look just a little too similar. It's the kind of place where people smile at you in passing but clutch their purses a little tighter if you linger too long. Being one of the few black homeowners here, I've grown used to the stares. The hushed conversations when I walk by. The way some of my neighbors act surprised when they see me stepping out of my own house. But I ignore it. I focus on my work, running a successful aerospace contracting business. And I enjoy my one true passion, flying. A few months ago, I purchased a sleek, black helicopter. A beauty. A Bell 505, to be exact. It was a business investment, but it was also mine. My way of celebrating years of hard work. I keep it at a private helipad most of the time, but every now and then, I bring it home for routine maintenance. And that's when the trouble started. First signs of trouble. It started with the notes. Anonymous, typed, and taped to my mailbox. Your aircraft is an eyesore. This is a residential neighborhood, not an airport. Take your helicopter somewhere else before we take action. I knew exactly who was behind it. The HOA president, Karen Whitmore. Karen, a middle-aged woman with a platinum bob, pastel sweaters, and a permanent scowl, ran the HOA like a dictatorship. She was the self-appointed enforcer of community standards, which mostly translated to keeping the neighborhood looking as white as possible. She had a history. A black doctor down the street mysteriously received multiple complaints about his garden being too wild. The Indian family next door? Suddenly hit with fines for a fence that had been there before they moved in. And now, it was my turn. I brushed off the notes at first. HOA rules had no jurisdiction over aircraft. They couldn't legally stop me from keeping my helicopter on my own property. So I ignored them. Big mistake. A growing sense of unease. One morning, I stepped outside to find Karen standing at the edge of my driveway, arms crossed. Behind her, 2 HOA board members, a retired cop and a local realtor, flanked her like bodyguards. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice dripping with forced politeness, "we need to talk about that thing in your yard." I glanced at my helicopter, parked neatly on a concrete pad. "You mean my aircraft?" Karen pursed her lips. "It's disruptive. We've had complaints. It's bringing down property values." I folded my arms. "That's funny. Because I checked the HOA guidelines. There's nothing in there about helicopters." Her nostrils flared. "Then we'll have to amend the rules." Something about the way she said it sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know it then, but this was just the beginning. A week passed, and the notes stopped. But the silence felt wrong. Like the eerie calm before a storm. Then, little things started happening. One morning, I went out to do a routine check on the helicopter, only to find deep scratches along the tail boom. Not accidental scuffs, deliberate, jagged scrapes, as if someone had taken a key or a sharp object to the metal. Another day, I woke up to find my driveway partially blocked by a golf cart. One of those ridiculous little white HOA-issued ones. Karen sat in the driver's seat, sunglasses perched on her nose, pretending to scroll through her phone. I watched her from my porch, waiting. She wanted me to say something. To engage. I didn't give her the satisfaction. But something about the way she sat there, unmoving, made my skin crawl. I checked my security cameras later that evening. The footage showed Karen pacing near my helicopter late at night, hands on her hips, looking at it like it offended her very existence. She never touched it, but the way she lingered sent a clear message. She was planning something. Karen tightens her grip. The next day, a letter arrived, this time, official-looking, with the HOA's embossed seal at the top. Violation notice. Your property is in breach of community aesthetic standards. Aircraft are not in accordance with the intended design of our neighborhood and must be removed immediately. Failure to comply will result in escalating fines and further action. I nearly laughed. This wasn't legal. She knew it. But Karen didn't care about rules, only control. I called the number on the letter, fully expecting to argue with some HOA lackey. Instead, Karen herself answered, her voice smooth but smug. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I see you got our notice." "This isn't enforceable," I said. "HOAs don't regulate aircraft." "Well," she said, dragging out the word, "that depends. We did just vote on a new amendment restricting non-traditional vehicles in driveways. Passed with an overwhelming majority." I clenched my jaw. "You made that rule because of me." "Let's not make this personal," she cooed. "It's about maintaining community harmony." My grip tightened on the phone. My helicopter isn't violating any state or FAA regulations. And it's on my private property. Karen sighed dramatically. "If you refuse to comply, we'll have no choice but to escalate the matter." She hung up before I could respond. I exhaled slowly, trying to suppress the unease creeping up my spine. Escalate how? A growing threat. That night, I heard noises outside. Footsteps. The unmistakable rustling of movement near the helicopter. I stepped onto my porch just in time to see shadows disappearing into the night. And that's when I knew Karen wasn't just trying to intimidate me. She was planning something bigger. The next morning, I walked straight to the HOA office. It was a small brick building near the community clubhouse, with pristine landscaping and a ridiculous gold-plated plaque that read, "Whitmore Estates HOA, preserving excellence since 1987. Inside, Karen sat behind a mahogany desk, sipping from a porcelain teacup like she ran a Fortune 500 company instead of a neighborhood gossip ring. Her two board members, Frank, the retired cop, and Linda, the realtor, sat beside her like obedient disciples. She didn't even look up when I stepped in. "Mr. Carter," she said smoothly, "how can we help you?" I tossed the violation notice onto her desk. "This is harassment." Karen let out a breathy laugh. "Oh, don't be so dramatic." She picked up the letter, flipping it idly. "You received a standard enforcement notice for violating community standards." "I'm not violating anything," I shot back. "HOAs don't regulate aircraft. And this non-traditional vehicle rule? You wrote it after I parked my helicopter at my house." Karen finally met my gaze. As I said, the rule passed with an overwhelming majority. Frank leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "The board had to act," he said, his voice carrying that authoritative tone ex-cops love to use. "Residents were complaining." "Which residents?" I asked. Silence. Linda shifted in her seat, suddenly fascinated by her clipboard. I let the moment stretch. "That's what I thought." Karen sighed dramatically, setting her teacup down with an audible clink. "Mr. Carter, you're making this difficult. Just move the helicopter, and we won't have to fine you." I crossed my arms. "And if I don't?" Her lips curled into a smile. "Then fines will accumulate. If they go unpaid, well, you know how liens work." There it was. The real threat. They wanted to financially squeeze me out. A line crossed. That night, I installed more security cameras, higher angles, better resolution. If Karen and her little goons were planning something, I'd catch them in the act. I didn't have to wait long. The next evening, I was in my home office when an alert popped up on my phone. "Motion detected, rear yard." I pulled up the live feed and felt my stomach drop. A group of men, at least 4 of them, were circling my helicopter. One of them carried a crowbar. Another had a can of spray paint. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher picked up. 911, what's your emergency?" "There are people trespassing on my property, trying to vandalize my helicopter," I said, keeping my voice even. "I need officers here now." The dispatcher took my information, but her voice held that familiar edge. The hesitation. "We'll send a unit," she said finally. But I already knew what would happen. The system at work. 20 minutes passed. No sirens. No patrol cars. But you know who did show up? Karen. She pulled up in her golf cart like she was arriving for an afternoon tea, not an active crime scene. She had the nerve to wave at the men who had just tried to vandalize my property. Then she turned to me, her expression full of fake concern. "Oh dear," she said. I heard there was some commotion over here. I clenched my fists. You sent them. Karen placed a hand over her heart, all wide-eyed innocence. I certainly did not. But, well, when people feel threatened in their own community, sometimes they act out. I took a step forward. You mean racists? Frank, the ex-cop, appeared behind her, arms crossed. Now, let's not make this about race, he said, like a true good OL boy. I barked a laugh. Funny, because if I had been the one trespassing, I'd be in cuffs right now. Frank's jaw tightened, but Karen just smiled. You really should consider moving that helicopter, Mr. Carter, she said sweetly, before something unfortunate happens. I held her gaze, my blood boiling. She wasn't just using the HOA rules to harass me. She was escalating, encouraging violence. And now I had proof. The fight back begins. I spent the next day compiling everything: security footage, Karen's threats, the vandalism attempts. Then I made some phone calls. First, to my lawyer. Then, to a contact at the FAA. And finally, to someone Karen never would have expected. The state governor's office. Karen wanted a fight? She was about to get one. 2 days later, Karen called for an emergency HOA meeting. The agenda: final enforcement action against unauthorized aircraft. I knew exactly what this was, her victory lap. She thought she had backed me into a corner, that I had no choice but to bow to her authority. She had no idea what was coming. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a pristine building with crystal chandeliers and framed pictures of past HOA presidents, all white. The place was packed. Residents filled the rows of cushioned chairs, whispering among themselves, eager for the drama. At the front, Karen sat at a long mahogany table, flanked by her loyal board members. She wore a smug little smile, like a queen preparing to hand down a royal decree. I took my seat near the front, arms crossed, waiting. Karen tapped her microphone. Let's begin. Karen's power play. She wasted no time. For months, we have attempted to resolve a disruptive issue in our community, she said, her voice oozing condescension. Mr. Carter's helicopter has been a nuisance, violating the harmony and aesthetics of our neighborhood. Some people in the crowd murmured in agreement. Others just looked uncomfortable. Karen continued. Despite multiple notices, grace periods, and attempts at dialogue, Mr. Carter has refused to comply. As a result, the HOA board has voted to issue a final penalty, an escalating fine of $1,000 per day until the helicopter is removed. Murmurs turned into full conversations. People glanced at me, some shaking their heads. Karen turned to me, eyes gleaming. Do you have anything to say before this ruling is finalized? I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. Yeah, I said. I'd love to hear how you plan to find the governor's office. A ripple of confusion spread through the room. Karen's smile faltered. Excuse me. I pulled out a folder and tossed it onto the table. This helicopter isn't just mine. It's leased in partnership with the state governor's office for official travel. I let that sink in before adding, which means every time you've targeted me, you've also been harassing state government property. The room went silent. Karen blinked rapidly. That's ridiculous. The governor has nothing to do with this. I smirked. Funny. Because his office disagrees. In fact, his legal team was very interested in all the security footage I provided. The vandalism attempts. The threats. The blatant targeting. I leaned in. They're considering this a case of criminal harassment. Karen's face drained of color. I wasn't done. The final blow. I stood up, turning to the crowd. This isn't about a helicopter. It's about control. I gestured toward Karen. She rewrote HOA rules just to target me. She sent people to vandalize my property. And when that didn't work, she threatened liens to try and force me out. A few people gasped. Others exchanged uneasy glances. I turned back to Karen. And here's the best part, because the helicopter is tied to the governor's office, any damages caused? That's destruction of government property. I folded my arms. Which means, You're looking at felony charges. Karen shot up from her seat, face twisted in panic. This is a lie. He's trying to manipulate all of you. I shrugged. Oh. Then maybe you'd like to explain why the governor's office just sent a cease and desist letter to the HOA. I pulled out another document and held it up. Effective immediately, all fines, restrictions, and harassment regarding the helicopter are void. Gasps. Whispers. Karen snatched the paper from my hand, scanning it, her hands trembling. Then, her worst nightmare. Frank, her loyal ex-cop board member, leaned over to glance at the letter. His face turned ashen. Karen, this is legit. Karen's breath hitched. No, this isn't happening. The doors burst open. 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies stepped inside, scanning the room. The lead deputy spoke, his voice booming. We're looking for Karen Whitmore. Karen's world collapses. Karen froze. What is this? The deputy pulled out a paper. Karen Whitmore, you are under investigation for conspiracy to commit vandalism, harassment, and interference with state property. We need you to come with us. The room erupted. Some people gasped. Others muttered in shock. Linda, the realtor, scooted away from Karen like she was contagious. Karen's chest heaved. This is a mistake. She turned desperately to Frank. Do something. But Frank just shook his head. I told you not to push it this far, Karen. Karen staggered back, her perfect world crumbling. I just watched. Collected. Justice was finally here. Karen's perfectly curated image shattered in an instant. The woman who spent years lording over Whitmore Estates, treating the HOA like her personal empire, was now frozen in place, eyes wide with sheer disbelief. The lead sheriff's deputy took a step forward. Ma'am, I need you to come with us. Karen shot up from her chair, knocking over her teacup. You can't be serious, she sputtered. This is outrageous. She turned to Frank, her ever-loyal enforcer. Frank, do something. But Frank, the same man who had backed her in every meeting, nodded along to every absurd rule change, just let out a long sigh and pinched the bridge of his nose. Karen, they've got evidence. Karen's manicured hands clenched into fists. This is harassment. He, she pointed at me, her voice shaking, is manipulating all of you. This is a setup. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed. Oh, Karen, you set this up. She turned back to the deputy. I demand to speak to someone in charge. I have connections. My husband knows the mayor. The deputy remained unfazed. You can make all the calls you want down at the station. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The HOA board members shifted uncomfortably. People who had once nodded along to Karen's rules were now whispering behind cupped hands, some even recording the scene on their phones. Her downfall was unfolding in real time. But I wasn't done yet. The final exposure. I pulled out my phone. Since you're so confident you did nothing wrong, let's go over some hard evidence. I tapped the screen, and my security footage began playing on the clubhouse's projector. The first clip showed a group of men sneaking onto my property in the dead of night, surrounding my helicopter. One held a crowbar. Another carried a can of spray paint. Gasps filled the room. Someone in the back muttered, Jesus! Then, the second clip. Karen, standing at the edge of my driveway, watching it happen. She wasn't just an innocent bystander, she was orchestrating it. The room exploded with whispers. I turned back to Karen, who had gone deathly pale. Her hands gripped the edge of the table like she might collapse. No, she whispered, shaking her head. This is out of context. I raised an eyebrow. Oh. Then maybe we should hear from this witness. A new voice rang out. I saw it happen. All heads turned as an older black man stood up in the back of the room. Mr. Thompson. My neighbor. One of the few black residents in Whitmore Estates. He adjusted his glasses, looking directly at Karen. I saw you, Karen, that night. Standing there, giving those men orders. And I saw you laugh when they started damaging his property. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Thompson, you're lying, she shrieked. But the damage was done. More voices joined in. I heard her brag about getting Carter out of the neighborhood, a woman said. She told me the helicopter was an eyesore and that certain people don't belong here, another added. The floodgates had opened. Karen turned in circles, eyes darting between former allies who were now backing away like she was contagious. She reached for Linda, the realtor, who yanked her arm away. I, Karen stammered, shaking her head violently. Then, one final dagger to the heart. A new voice spoke up, one that made Karen visibly flinch. I told you not to push this, Karen. Her husband, Mr. Whitmore himself. A tall, tired-looking man in a tailored suit stepped into the room, rubbing his temples like he had a migraine from hell. You did this, he muttered, his voice a mix of disbelief and exhaustion. Karen's breath hitched. Dee, darling, you know I was just protecting our community. I didn't mean for... Her husband held up a hand, cutting her off. Then he turned to the deputies. Is this serious? The deputy nodded. Very. Mr. Whitmore exhaled, long and slow. Then, to everyone's shock, he turned to Karen and said, Then do what you need to do, officers. A sharp gasp rippled through the room. Karen staggered back like he had slapped her. W.H. what? No. You're my husband. You're supposed to stand by me. Her husband's jaw tightened. I stood by you for years, Karen. Through every ridiculous rule, every complaint about those people moving in. But this... He gestured toward the projector screen. This is insanity. Karen shook her head wildly. No. No. But the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. It was over. The fall of Karen Whitmore. The deputies led Karen toward the exit as she screamed, You can't do this to me. I am the HOA. I am. The doors swung shut behind her, cutting off the sound. Silence fell over the room. Then, applause. It started small, then grew. Residents clapped, some even cheering. I turned to the board. Frank was sweating bullets. Linda looked like she wanted to vanish into thin air. I leaned in. So, about those fines? Linda swallowed hard. We'll be rescinding them. Effective immediately. I smirked. Good. I turned to leave, walking out into the night, the weight of injustice finally lifting off my shoulders. Justice had been served. And Karen Whitmore? Her reign was officially over. The next morning, Whitmore Estates woke up to a new reality. Karen Whitmore was gone. Not just removed from the HOA board. Not just fined. She had been arrested, booked at the county jail, and charged with conspiracy to commit vandalism, harassment, and destruction of government property. By noon, the news had spread like wildfire. Local reporters swarmed the entrance of our gated community, shoving microphones in residents' faces. The once invincible HOA queen had become a public spectacle, her mugshot plastered all over social media. Disgraced HOA president arrested in government property scandal, one headline read. Local HOA leader faces felony charges after targeting black homeowner, another said. And my personal favorite. HOA nightmare. Woman who tried to destroy a helicopter ends up destroying her own life. The consequences catch up. Karen's world crumbled fast. The governor's office filed an official complaint against her. Civil lawsuits loomed on the horizon. Her own husband, the man who had silently tolerated her reign of terror, filed for divorce within a week. And financially, she was wrecked. With legal fees piling up, Karen was forced to sell her custom-built McMansion, the very house she once used as a throne. Rumor had it she moved into a cramped apartment on the other side of town, far from the pristine community she once ruled. No security gate. No HOA to hide behind. Just a lonely, bitter woman with nothing left. Whitmore Estates after Karen. With Karen gone, the HOA board scrambled to save face. Frank resigned immediately, citing stress. Linda tried to spin things, claiming she had never supported Karen's agenda, despite years of enforcing her policies. The remaining board members, desperate to avoid more lawsuits, held an emergency vote to overhaul the HOA charter. New rule: no single person would ever hold as much power as Karen had. But the biggest change. The racial tension in Whitmore Estates finally cracked. Neighbors who once stayed silent, who turned a blind eye to Karen's actions, began to talk. "I never realized how bad it had gotten," one woman admitted to me at the grocery store. "We should have done something sooner," Mr. Reynolds, an older resident, said with guilt in his voice. Even Linda, ever the opportunist, pulled me aside after a meeting. "I just want to say, I'm sorry for everything." I just nodded. I wasn't looking for apologies. Actions spoke louder. My triumph. 2 weeks later, I stood in my backyard, watching the sun set behind my fully intact helicopter. No HOA fines. No threats. No vandalism. Just peace. Mr. Thompson, my longtime neighbor, strolled over with a beer in hand. "Hell of a few months, huh?" I chuckled. "You could say that." He took a sip, nodding toward the helicopter. "So, you ever gonna take me up in that thing?" I smirked. "I think you've earned a ride." He grinned. "Damn right I have." As the last bit of sunlight dipped below the horizon, I let out a deep breath. I had fought back. I had won. And Karen Whitmore? She learned the hard way. When you build your power on hate and control, it only takes one storm to bring it all crashing down.